Hello everybody, I hope you're all having an amazing day. It's Wednesday, so we're going to be covering another opening for you guys here today, and I'm going to be introducing you to the two knights attack against the Caro-Kann. So, what is the two knights attack? As you can see, going from the Caro-Kann, it's pretty self-explanatory. We get both our knights out. We don't play a d4, we don't play a d3, we don't play anything else. We play knight f3, followed by knight c3. And, yeah, it's a cool one. It's what I personally play, so this is all my theory, gathered from engine lines, opening explorer videos, stuff like that. And I like it. It's what I personally play. I like it because it gets black out of their comfort zone. A lot of Caro-Kann players like to play the same thing, and they like their positions. So this just breaks it up, and it gets them into an area they might not be perfectly familiar with. Now this is a viable opening all the way from beginner level up to even master and grandmaster level. Obviously none of this prep is going to be of grandmaster level. This is like 1700-ish level, 1650, something along those lines. But yeah, it's an attacking opening as well. So if you're an attacking player and you like aggressive games, then this is right up your alley. And it gets away from the advance or the exchange, stuff like that. So it's a nice little surprise as well against your opponent if they potentially know what you play, just to shake things up a bit. There are a couple trappy lines. It's not an opening designed for traps. It's not like a gambit or anything. So we're just going to go over a couple quick traps that you should know before we get into the real juicy lines. So you might be asking yourself straight away, what happens if they play d4 here? Because you've not played d4 yourself. So it's a logical move that they take the space and they kick your knight. And if they play d4 here, you should just be super happy as white. It's a huge mistake, really. D4, knight to e2. Where else is the knight going? And now you can see you're actually hitting the pawn with two pieces. And they're going to struggle to defend. They can't play e5, and they can't play knight c6, so they're going to have to play c5. At which point it's really important that you play c3. That's the only move for white here. Well, you could play other things, I guess, but c3 is the main move, and it's the best move. And here black can actually hold on to their pawn. If they do d takes c3, it holds on to their pawn, and it's important for you to play b takes, just so you're supporting this d4 push. If you take with the knight, the d4 push is still potentially on, but it's not as nice because you can't replace it with another pawn. So you're going to go b takes, and then you're just looking for the d4 push. You develop your pieces as normal, and you play on. You've got a nice position. However, if they go d3, which again looks like a very logical move, you're hitting the knight, you're kicking it about more, and you're claiming more space. It's going to be awkward for this dark squared bishop to develop and such. Then you actually play knight to f4. And you can see now this is very scary for black indeed. You've got this discovered attack from the bishop coming in. And again, black's struggling to defend this pawn. Their only move is actually c4. At which point, the eagle-eyed viewers may be aware, queen to a4 check completely just wins the pawn. They can block however way they want. And you just take the c-pawn. And you're threatening to take this d-pawn as well, so you could potentially be up 2 pawns in this situation. And they could do a number of things here. You just focus on developing as fast as you can, especially this dark squared bishop. If you can win this pawn, great. If not, get this dark squared bishop out, get castled as soon as you can. But e5 is a very good chance for them. And it's still winning, but it gets tricky. Knight d5, you're blocking off the queen's access from this pawn. You're free to pick that up with the bishop, castle, all this good stuff. And this pawn on e5 is potentially weak as well. So you just have a really nice position, and you're potentially up 2 pawns. So that's the first important trappy little line to know, and it's super common, especially at a beginner level. When I first started playing this, I saw d4 a bunch, and I ended up winning a lot of them because I knew the theory. So if they play d4, just be super happy. The next line is another bit of a trap slash sacrifice. I will warn you, the moves to get there aren't solid. I've just put random moves in basically to get to a knight's position. They're similar to some lines. You might notice this is actually a mating one with knight to d6, so that's a possible idea as well. But let's say white doesn't see that and they play on. Takes. Black plays some random moves. You are actually threatening mate here with bishop c4. So you can either take or push e6. If they decide to push e6, it's white to win here. If you can find the move, amazing. And it's a really common idea you need to be aware of in the two knights. Knight takes f7. You're forking the rook and the queen. King takes. And after king takes, queen takes e6 is actually mate. Some variations it's not mate. You can move up or something if the knight's still on f6. But then you can see it gets, again, very scary for black. So this is just a little sacrifice theme you need to be aware of. Again, the moves to get there aren't exact. I've just sort of made the position happen regardless of how good the moves are. But remember this sack on f7. It is super important and quite common as well, surprisingly common. The important thing to note, this bishop can't be defending this pawn. There needs to be something in the way, or the bishop needs to move onto this fianchetto or something along those lines, or this diagonal, in order for this sacrifice to work. But yeah, that's about that. Let's move on to the actual lines of theory rather than these silly traps. So the first line we're going to look at is d takes e4. There's sort of three things they can do here. D takes e4, bishop there, or knight f6. Those are the three we're going to look at. So starting off with d takes e4, you're just going to go ahead with knight takes. You might as well keep the pawn. You know, you're not wanting to be down a pawn. And then knight f6 is the main idea here. They could potentially go knight d7, but to be honest, a lot of the time that transposes. Although the computer is recommending a slightly different moveset after knight to d7. It's recommending something along these lines, with the bishop coming to c4 and the knight coming to g5. But if not, if they go knight f6 straight away, you actually play a bit of a weird move here. You play queen to e2. Now this looks like it's trapping in the bishop, but to be honest, it's not really. Most of the time they do this. They trade off the knights, and they try to get another knight back on f6 here. So that's the main idea. You're not trapping in your bishop for long. So after they take and they go knight to d7, which, to be honest, a majority of the time they will. I guess they could do some other things like an e6, but after that, their position is worse. They're locking in their light squared bishop, stuff like that. You keep developing with bishop to c4, and you again are hitting this f7 square. And after they try to kick your knight again, you do this really, really nice intermezzo move. And if you don't know what intermezzo means, it means like in between. So you do an in between move. You sacrifice the queen on e4. The knight can actually take this. The problem is bishop takes f7 is actually checkmate. Black's blocked in with their own pieces. The knight's covering the d7 square, and the knight's covering the f7 square. So once the bishop takes, it's actually checkmate. So you do this, and then they're sort of forced to play e6 here. I guess they could play bishop to e6, but after bishop takes, you've doubled their pawns, and you're happy. So they play e6, and you drop the bishop back. You drop the queen back to e2. And here you've got a nice position. It's very nice, but there are lots and lots of things black can do here. So we're just going to sort of leave this here. The main move is bishop to d6. They can also play bishop to e7, and they can also play bishop to b5. So these three are the main moves. Say it's bishop d6, castles here. Your queen's already covering the knight, so that's fine. And their theme here is to go queen c7 and try to win this knight and try to put pressure on this h2 pawn. The knight can always come back and cover, but you might as well leave this knight here. So you go ahead and play d5, castles, and then rook e1. And this knight's not going anywhere. They would have to maneuver and play f6, at which point knight f3 is perfectly fine. The other things they can do, b5. The bishop can go back either way. Ideally, you would have played d4 maybe with a c3 in order to drop the bishop back to d3. So you can sort of hit the queen with these two bishops. But if you have to go back to b3, that's perfectly fine as well. You're sort of hitting the king with the same ideas of potentially a sacrifice even. So back to b3 is fine. If they go to e7, again, just castle, develop, play d4, c3 if you have to. And just have a good game, you know, develop. You've got the central space, you've got better pieces. This light squared bishop especially is going to be terrible for black, and they're going to have to work quite hard in order to keep that on the board. I will say as well, a4 is a really good move practically any time in this opening, especially if the bishop's on c4. a4 is almost a must play, and it's something you can do to sort of fill a move. If you're not quite sure, a4 is the way to go. The whole idea is it's stopping b5. So this bishop can sit here pretty much permanently throughout the game. It can come back. It can come back again. And especially with c3, d4 played, all your light squares are going to be really flexible. You can get your bishop onto c2. You can get your queen onto d3. And then automatically you're looking at checkmates on h7. So those are the general themes of this opening. Like I said, this gets very complicated and it can go all the way into an endgame, this line. So we're just going to stop it here. If you want to research this on your own, please do, depending on what level you're at. But if you are like anywhere from a beginner to even 1500 level, these 12 moves of theory are going to be perfectly fine for you. Yeah, on to the next one. What do we have here? We have d takes e. Again, knight takes, knight f6, queen e2. There we go, same stuff. But instead of playing knight to d7, we have a queen to d5. Queen d5 is a really interesting move. Obviously looking for the trade. Now, as white, you're playing the two knights attack. The key word is the attack. You need to keep your pieces on the board. That's the whole idea. You need to keep the pieces on the board. There are some ideas of bishop to d3 here. Looking for trade and replace with the bishop, then d4, d3, if you like that sort of thing. The computer move is to actually go h5 here. I'm not really sure the reasoning behind this. I think it's just keeping the queen on the board, keeping the support of the d4 square. And yeah, you're good. Keep the pieces on the board. That's what I will say about this opening. Black is going to constantly try to trade things off. You're going to avoid it as much as you can. Eventually you will have to, but make sure you're getting something out of the trades. One way to carry on is queen to e6. At which point bishop e2. Again, you're developing as much as you can. And the main way to play for black is to go queen to g4. Again, not trading. You are not trading at all if you can help it. Queen g3 is the way to go, and finally you can let them trade. But you can see we're actually getting something out of this. We're getting the open h file, and we're going to hit this h7 pawn with a bishop to d3 after a d4, and you can see we're actually getting a lot of play out of trading this queen at this point. Bishop f5. This is a really interesting move actually. After bishop to f5, you play b3. Now this looks like it's just sacrificing the c2 pawn, but you can see here if they take d3. What's white doing with this bishop? It's trapped. It's completely trapped. They can get the two pawns for it, but again, you're actually just opening lines for our rooks. So it's super nice. So knight d7. You fianchetto. They still can't take this, and then along castles is just fine. So again, you've got something out of the queen trade. You put it off for as long as you can. You've got something out of it. You do a cheeky little pawn sack, and then you queenside castle. You know, you've got d4 coming. You want to get this knight out, and you want to start pushing these pawns, potentially attack the king side. Stuff like that is just a nice position. The other thing they can do is queen to g6. Now this gets a bit tricky. Castles, and then you let them take this c2 pawn. And basically you just have to claim that you're better here. It is tricky to play. You have to just trust in the position that you're better. You know, they can't take any more pawns, but realistically, they've only developed one. Maybe you could class this bishop as developed, although not really. Rook e1's coming. You know, you play d4, get this bishop out as well, and potentially you have a very good attack on your hands. Obviously, d4, you would cut off your support to the c4 bishop, but you've got a lot of ideas. And yeah, castling, you just give up the pawn. And giving up this pawn's quite a common idea in the two knights. Just be aware of it. You don't have to do it if you don't want. I think there's other moves here. Queen c4, if you really want to hang on to this pawn, is still fine as well. Queen g2, and then rook g1. That's quite common as well. And potentially even long castle after a d4. And it's okay. It's okay. You know, if it depends how you want to play it. I think you actually do have to give up a pawn either way, though. So be comfortable with that and just have faith in the position that you are better. And try use the development the best you can. So, what do we have next? We have bishop to f5. Now, bishop to f5 is one of the more fun variations of the two knights. So after the pawn takes, the bishop comes in and the knight takes. Knight to g3 is the way to go. And here, bishop to g6 is actually the main move. They could potentially go to g4. You should be happy here. It sort of transposes into another variation very loosely. There are a few key differences, particularly this knight on g3. And again, queen d5. And again, you're not trading off. You want something from this queen trade. And it's the same idea of opening up your rook to attack the pawn. So you're not letting them trade off on your terms. If you let them trade off here, you're going to be double isolating your pawns, isolating this pawns, and your bishop's going to have a hard time as well. So you go to b3 and let them trade off and take inwards. A takes b. And then actually you've got a really nice move here, b4. b4 is quite cool, and the whole idea is they could try hit it with e6, but that's actually not your idea to keep this on b4. Your idea is b5, which is mind-blowing, to be fair. And if they take, you're developing your bishop with a tempo. You can castle quickly. And if not, you just leave it there, actually. You leave it there, and it's a pain. It's a real pain for black to deal with. They could try play a6, but again, you just leave it. Their rook's pinned. And they could try do some other things. You just focus on developing and you leave this there. You make sure your bishop can take it though, so you can't play like a d3. You would have to go d4. And the whole point is stopping their knight developing. And it's a real pain. So if they go like c5, maybe like a c4 even could work. And you're just stopping this knight developing. They would have to go to d7, at which point you can take. And you've isolated their pawns for your double pawn. So it's a really good trade for you. And this b4, b5 idea is a killer one. So please do remember that if you get the chance. And that is from the bishop to g4 line. With the queen trade, going to b3. But bishop to g6 is the main move indeed. At which point you play this h4 idea. Now this h4 idea is super common in the two knights Caro. Also in the two knights French as well, so it's important to know. Now black can do two things here. They're quite similar. We'll say h5. We'll go first with h5. h5 is not ideal. The better move is h6, and you go knight to e5. Hitting the bishop, you're potentially even threatening some mates with the usual sort of tactics as well that we've already covered. Queen d6 is the move here. At which point d4, you're just developing, looking after this knight. This bishop can't actually go anywhere. If it goes back, that's just good for you because you can take this pawn. Basically, you're cutting off support from the rook. Threatening mate-ish things as well is important to note. So they can't move backwards now. And once they try to kick out your knight, you're just happy to take the bishop. And after a bishop to e2, because they've moved the pawn onto h5, that's actually a big weakness for them. And you could potentially claim that pawn eventually. I think knight f6 covers it immediately, but like some bishop g5 maybe and trade off the knights. The knight could replace it as well. So you got to be careful, but eventually, potentially, you are winning this pawn. So h6 is the way to go. And this is nicer because it's not a target anymore. And you can actually move the bishop back to h7. So knight to e5 again, and followed by queen d6 as well. If they go back, this is really nice for you. And the eval is saying 1.7 for white here, so you are actually on top, 1.8 even. Queen to h5, and this is super scary. You're hitting this pawn immediately, and they're going to have a hard time defending it. g6 is the way to go, at which point you can play this intermezzo again, bishop to c4, super common theme, followed by e6 is the only move. At which point, queen to e2. And you have this same idea of sacrificing on the f-pawn if they're not careful. Queen to c7, both hitting the knight potentially and covering the f7 pawn. d4, their knight comes out. They could do like a bishop to d6, but knight comes out, the bishop comes out, and this gets super tricky here. You can actually sacrifice this knight. Their best move is to take this bishop. If they decide to take the knight with the queen, you take the bishop. If they take with the king, you can go check and take the bishop. Check on e6 and take the bishop, and you're up 2 pawns. So their best move is to take your bishop, at which point you're happy taking their rook. With still check as well, I will add. So their best move is... so that was from bishop to h7. Their best move is queen d6 again. At which point d4... knight d7, you take the bishop again, just like before. Once they've kicked your knight out, you take the bishop. And now it's not as nice because the pawn's not on h5. It's exactly the same position, but the pawn's not on h5. So you just play c3, you get the bishop onto d3, and you just play on. You've got a nice position. It's slightly better for white. It's 0.9, so it's nice. They're not going to be able to long castle, really, although they'll give it a good try, you know. But it's going to be a weak spot for them. And these pieces here are going to have a hard time developing as well. Likely an e6 sort of thing. So you really need to be ready with the pawn breaks as soon as you can once they long castle, before they can get their other pieces to the rescue. And if you can, potentially harass this queen as much as possible as well. So that's that line. Key things, h5, bad move. h5 is a bad move, and you can take advantage of that. And then bishop to h7, also a bad move. So those are the two things you've got to look out for. Other than that, it's pretty equal, slightly better for white. The next position we have is going to be bishop to g4. This is slightly similar to the other one. You play h3. Now they can take here. If they go back, it sort of transposes into another variation. So they take here. You take with the queen, like before. And then knight f6 is the way to go. If they decide to take, you actually take with the knight rather than the queen, because you don't have this h takes g3 anymore after the... Let's show it actually. You don't have this h takes g. Actually, no, they can't take with the queen because the knight's covering. So anyway, you take with the knight. If you take with the queen, it's still okay, not quite as good. You're getting kicked around with knight f6. That's the reason why, sorry, I got confused there. So you take with the knight, avoiding all this kicking around. And you just sort of play on. The queen could come to d5. It's not as good. e6, bishop out, knight out, usual developing moves. So knight f6 here. It's tempting to play e5. Don't. Basically, don't is the answer. It's not worth it. They want this. They want this closed structure. And especially seeing as how they don't have their light squared bishop out anymore. That's gone. They're happy to lock up all the pawns on the light squares. So don't fall for that. It's not worth it. At this point, you play g3. And again, you're happy with them trading because you're freeing up spaces for your powerful bishops. You have the bishop pair. You want the position to be open. E6 is the move here. If they decide to play E5, this gets quite tricky. You take their d pawn, they take back. Bishop G2 here. Here they will try E4. They could try knight there, but then yeah, queen takes B7. So they're gonna kick your queen with E4. Queen D1 is key here. Anywhere else is just dubious. And then bishop to b4. So they're trying to sort of want you to play e3 followed by d4. You're not going to let them. You're just going to castle, and then d3 is fine. And you're undermining this pawn structure. You're going to try claim that they've overextended a bit, especially seeing as how they don't have their light squared bishop anymore. So e6 is the way to go. Again, you're not playing e5 no matter what. Bishop g2. Continue with your fianchetto plans. Bishop b4. a3. You just kick that out. Again, they try push. You move it out of the way. You're all good. Bishop takes, and you take with the queen. Actually, you take with the queen. It's tempting to take with one of the pawns, but then their pawn pushes come quite quick, and it's a bit scary. So you take with the queen, and yes, they can do b4, not b4, d4. But then queen to c4, and you are hitting a few things. You're stopping them castle as well. And again, overextended. Now e4 would be e5 would be an amazing idea for you. So at this point, they're happy taking on the e4. It looks like they're winning the pawn, and temporarily they are. But after a b3, they continue developing. You bring your other bishop in to fianchetto, and actually this pawn's super weak. You can undermine it with pawn pushes, or you could try to outright win it. But basically, you're claiming you have the better position. You have really powerful bishop pairs that are both fianchettoed. You could castle either way, potentially. And you just have a nice position. Eventually, you will win this pawn. And you play on. You know, you just trust in the position, trust that in the bishop pair, and have faith that you will get this pawn back. So b3, it looks counterintuitive, but it makes total sense. And you let them have this central e-pawn. Because they're disconnected pawns. They're not disconnected technically. They could play an f5, but then, you know, their king side's going to be weak. This pawn's going to be weak. And it's just going to be super nice for you. So, what do we have next? We have, again, bishop to g4, h3, but they don't take this time. They go back to h5. And again, this is super, super nice for you. Anything where you're able to get the h4, h5 ideas in is super, super nice. Before you play g4, you have to take the pawn. It's quite important. You have to take the pawn. And that's just stopping them now locking it up potentially. And making you super cramped. So you take it first. And then you play g4. Kicking the bishop back to g6. And this is quite a familiar position. Except some slight differences in the center. d4 now to stop them moving this pawn any further. And claiming some space in the center. Knight to c6 is probably what you're going to see. Just attacking this a bit and then covering any like knight to e5 ideas. h4, again, you want to kick this bishop out as quickly as possible. It's not as nice because you didn't get h4 straight away. You had to play h3, but it doesn't particularly matter. The same threats apply. Here, e6 is the main move. There are a few other moves we will cover. H6, H5, both very similar. Again, H5 is the slightly worse option for black. Knight to E5, either way, the knight takes. And they could do a few things. If they play E6 and they allow the bishop check, you should be super happy. So A6 is the way. And if they go H5, it's a very similar thing with the A6 rather than the E6. And you just sort of leave this here, maybe. You fianchetto your bishop. It is common to see kingside castling here. Queenside is probably slightly safer. But yeah, you could sort of do either. And you just sort of work on their underdevelopment, work on their open king, and try do some stuff, win this pawn. But yeah, the other major thing they could do is knight to f6. Now, this is a super, super tricky line. And you should all know this. Knight to e5, like usual. Now, you might think, this is getting a bit dubious over this side, and it does. The queen's coming to c7, at which point you play bishop to f4, just developing, and you're making potential threats on the queen as well with knight takes g6. Queen b6 is a super tricky move and a really nice one. They're threatening two things, potentially even three things afterwards as well. And here you need to play h5. There are a few other things you can do, but h5 is the most critical line. And the whole point is the bishop's getting trapped, so they need to do something, but they have potential counterplay as well. So bishop e4 is a really good intermezzo move, just hitting your rook before they do any of this stuff. At which point f3, and you just sort of have to trust that these trades work out for white. They get very complicated. f3, and then they take b2, so they're threatening not the rook just yet, but definitely the knight with check. And you move your bishop back to d2. You're not particularly concerned about this just yet. They try for some trades. Knight takes e5. You take back with the d-pawn, and you are actually threatening this knight at the same time. At this point, they take your bishop. Now, you can't take this bishop because they take your rook. Your queen's pinned to your rook. So what do? You play bishop to b5 check, looking to potentially even castle and make real trouble for the queen. Potentially some pawn takes knight d5 check, bishop coming in, tons of crazy stuff. But their best move here is actually queen takes bishop, because your queen is still hanging, and you're not going to take this back. You actually take their bishop back. Yes, potentially you could do this, but it gets a bit sketchy. So you take their bishop, and now black is still up a piece. However, their knight is still hanging, and their queen as well. So you're getting the piece back. The queen moves to safety, and you take the knight on f6. And here, they could potentially get the pawn back. It's saying queen to e6 check first. You could also do g takes. And you're even on material. But white's still not developed their black bishop, and they're going to have a hard time doing so. They have a few weaknesses as well. You have open files for your rook, although, it's sketchy doing stuff. Your king is in the open, though, so you need to make the most of your pieces as quickly as possible, and you can't let black get a good setup. So you just have to trust those are okay. But e6 here instead, after the bishop moves back and the knight comes out, e6 is just safe. And you have a good game. Knight e5 is a good idea with some bishop b5, stuff like that. And I implore you guys to all research this yourself, because it gets super, super crazy and quite fun. The bishop could potentially get trapped, so they are potentially looking at some h6, h5 ideas as well. Too much to talk about in one video, but this is the general idea of trapping this bishop, getting the knights in, getting the bishop checks, all this good stuff. But yeah, there are way too many sidelines and all that to talk about now. So please look it up yourselves. There are tons of resources online. The last line we are talking about here is going to be knight f6. This is one of the more trickier ones. E takes d5 is the way to go. I think e5 is actually the computer line. I would ignore this. Not because it's bad. It is the computer line. But for anyone under 1800, even 1900, stay away from it. It's way too complicated. And it's not just complicated as well. It's risky. The risk level for white is super high. There is a big attack on your king. And the risk level for black is not really much at all. So it's not worth the 0.3 of evaluation that comes with it. So it's much easier to take E takes d5, C takes with d5, and you actually get a super similar position to the last example we've just shown with bishop to g4. If they take with a knight, d4, bishop to f5, bishop to d3, and you sort of play it like almost a Londonish system, almost like a normal d4 opening, and potentially even knight takes d5 is similar to the knight f6 Scandinavian that we looked at last week. So definitely have a look at that as well. But you just play the super sound, b takes, not queen takes, just so you're supporting the pawn a bit more. And you have a nice-ish position. So e takes, c takes, d4, bishop to g4. They could do like other stuff. If you can play h3 to avoid this whole bishop getting active, e6. And the key moves to sort of consider in this line is bishop to d3 and bishop to e3 as well. They don't look super active, but they are quite dangerous. You could long castle, you could short castle. You could launch an attack on the king as well. The bishop on e3 is also supporting this pawn if you ever lose this knight for whatever reason. a6 is another one, just standard stuff. Get the bishops out to d3 and e3. But bishop to g4 just transposes again. They could move it back and transpose it more directly. Bishop to f3 is interesting. Queen takes, knight c3, bishop to e3, bishop to d3 again as well. It's super simple. Just repeat the same sort of thing, and you'll be fine. So that is the Caro-Kann. So again, I will recap the main things they can do. D takes, knight f6, bishop out as well. So those are the three things. There are tons of sidelines and everything. However, they're not confusing sidelines in my opinion. They're all pretty logical, and oftentimes they transpose to one another, which is really good. Also, actually, d4 is another thing I will say. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed that. Give it a try. Give it a try no matter what. If you think it's not your style, give it a try anyway. It can't hurt. You will learn something from it. And if you end up liking it, then you found a new secret weapon against the Caro-Kann. It's personally one of my favourite lines, actually. I will go ahead and say that. It's one of the most consistent lines I've played, and I've had good results against the Caro-Kann. But anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you all learned something. Please like if you liked. Please subscribe if you really liked. And I'll catch you guys all tomorrow. Bye-bye.